October 19th, 1958. Brookhaven Laboratory in New York conducts their annual Visitors' Day. On display is a wide array of equipment and interesting technologies that nobody remembers. However, one machine draws a great deal of attention. William Alfred Higginbotham was the head of instrumentation at Brookhaven and had worked on the Manhattan Project. Like many of the scientists who had also worked on the Manhattan Project, Higginbotham would devote his life towards finding less destructive uses for atomic power. Such was the purpose of Brookhaven. However, Higginbotham was also an entertainer, and it drove him to get the public involved at the Brookhaven Visitors' Days. The base of his interactive machine was actually built upon an already present circuitry program described in the instruction booklet of an analog computer, the Donner Model 30. These computers simulated physical attributes and were often paired with oscilloscopes for display, and Higginbotham honed in on a program in which a ball bounced around the viewing area. After working out a design, it was constructed and debugged by colleague Robert Dvorak, taking in total about 3 days to construct. The game was a sports game, simulating a two-dimensional game of tennis. Two players batted the ball back and forth across a one-line net with a trajectory for the ball drawn in the direction of its swing. Gravity was a variable which could be altered as well, continuing the physics simulation desires of other programs we've encountered. The controllers had a knob for the volleying angle and a button that made the most satisfying of clicks. The exhibit was immensely popular. Higginbotham recalled that long lines formed to wait for a turn to play, which became a problem given the 5-inch screen. It returned the following year with a proper CRT monitor and some expanded options for the physics simulation, and after that, Higginbotham left the exhibit behind him. Just like every other computerized plaything before it, it was put aside after attracting an unexpected amount of public attention, which existed to promote real science. Clearly, they were onto something. But why so dismissive of public interest? Higginbotham would state that the game was a minor accomplishment, basically pilfered from the instruction booklet that the ball program came from. And yet, this moment has been dissected by historians, as well as reproduced twice at Brookhaven Labs itself. It couldn't have been a commercial product due to the advanced equipment involved, and had it been patented, the US government would have owned the rights. Only 4 years later, though, we'll see a video game used as a benchmark demonstration of a computer's capabilities to sell serious facilities. Why didn't somebody see this? Much of this restraint likely had to do with the scholarly attitudes of the scientists who operated these machines, as well as that cost factor. While let it never be said that computer programmers don't have a sense of fun, very few in those days dared dream big about what computers were meant to be, and those who did could only do so much. It would take a new vanguard of intelligent minds who had big ideas about how computers could be used beyond military installations to give us the next leap forward in interactive computer games. To this end, we revisit Whirlwind, and begin forming a contiguous line of hardware which will guide us to computers as truly interactive devices. Two colleagues, Kenneth Olson and Wes Clark, had assisted on the Whirlwind project and had a shared vision for an upgraded version of the machine which incorporated transistors, a relatively new type of electronic component called the TX-1. Jay Forrester, head of Whirlwind, rejected this design, so they scaled down its magnitude and created the TX-0, which went live in 1956. Despite the conceptual downgrade, the TX-0 was still an impressive beast. Its real-time 512 by 512 point plotting display was situated for use at all times by the computer user, and a light pen, first introduced on the Whirlwind, became an increasingly important part of the computer's programs. Visual demonstration and human-computer interaction was a large part of the TX0's major contribution to computers, even beyond games. However, there were games indeed, mostly in the realm of advanced artificial intelligence. The most unique among them was created by John E. Ward and Douglas T. Ross, called the Mouse Program. The two of them had developed a similar program on a UNIVAC 1103 in Florida, and so collaborated on creating a real showcase for this computer. Ross did the mathematical end, while Ward was largely responsible for the software implementation. The demonstration, first shown in January of 1959, featured an 8x8 maze with a graphically drawn mouse inside, looking about for all the available cheeses in the maze. It was a test of artificial intelligence, and running the program a second time after victory demonstrated that the mouse could remember the fastest path to the cheeses. The actual interactive part came from using the light pen to construct the maze, which altered how the mouse actually traversed the area. A user would draw lines between points to build walls to create a challenge for the machine to solve, with the player incentivized to create a solvable maze by the mouse having a limited amount of energy, which would deplete when the mouse was without food for too many turns. The pathfinding wasn't exactly about finding the most expedient route, and in fact, one humorous variation of the game included martinis that the mouse could sip to make it stumble about. The demo also had a fair number of bugs which were never fully worked out. Still, this program was one of the most powerful game-like intelligences outside of chess and checkers programs for a good long while afterwards. However impressive the slightly non-interactive mouse was, the TX0 was still a restricted platform. Only very specialized graduate students and teachers were those creating simulations, and they drew the line at understanding the system. Those with the desire to push those capabilities would be the vanguards of the medium, and it wouldn't be long until this passion was blaring from campuses across the world. Before that, though, we take a detour over to the IBM mainframes. As previously hinted, these machines and the storied company behind them were not particularly concerned about enticing the broader public. They had the most high-class, reliable machines for the business market, and the price of the machines reflected that. IBM was putting some money into creating software for their catalogs, but the first truly unique game would come from a bored employee in Ohio. John, or Jack Bergeson, was a physicist who had been recruited by IBM in 1957, and he eventually found himself at odds with his routine computer tasks, which included running business simulations. He had access to a beast known as the IBM 1620, and he wondered if there were ways he could learn from it and allay his boredom. Baseball would be the answer. He was a big fan of the sport, and he managed to convince his brother Paul, an IBM client, to help him write a program which could play baseball matches. At the end of 1960, they began working on a program which would become known as the BBC V1K, the baseball demonstration. It was coded in the IBM 1620's assembly language called the Symbolic Programming System. They gathered various statistics, such as runs batted in and batting averages, from real contemporary and historical players to give the game a sense of realism and depth. The user would choose 9 players and then be presented with a long recap of the game as it played out on a teletype terminal, printing every line as the data was processed. The first version of the program was put to the typewriter in early 1961, with test runs and debugging culminating in a finalized version dated September 11th of that year. Of course, Bergeson didn't exactly get away scot-free for his use of the computer. After his program was added to the IBM software catalog, it was subsequently removed by those who saw the demonstration as a waste of time and resources. He had started to capture the imagination of some, though, including a radio producer named Reggie Kordick, who recorded an advertisement of sorts for the program to pitch to those who saw no use for it.
This is all-time All-Star Baseball.
Bergeson also argued that since the program had been made with the help of his brother, it was a sort of community service taking place, since his brother was a client. Eventually, some important IBM employees managed to put it back into the software catalog, where it remained until the IBM 1620 was discontinued. It spread decently far by the end, but ultimately didn't have much of a direct influence outside of its very specific clientele. This was not the only game written for the IBM computer line either. There was a scene of users who created entertainment programs for the system and even managed to get them into the catalog. But none were quite as well preserved or expansive in scope as Bergeson's. These groups were small, though, and not encouraged by the companies involved, except in the case of educational games. Put a pin in that. Bergeson's game was daring, but a new computer philosophy was about to take shape, which would help make games a little less unwanted. Kenneth Olsen, co-creator of the TX-0, decided to go commercial in 1957, with assistance from partner Harlan Anderson upon realizing the potential for transistor and demo-based computers from his earlier experiences. The two managed to secure some outside investment, despite skepticism about going up against giants like IBM, and formed Digital Equipment Corporation, or DEC, based out of Maynard, Massachusetts. After establishing themselves as a computer components provider, DEC managed to create their own computer design, which was revealed in December 1959, called the Programmed Data Processor 1, or the PDP-1. The price was $120,000 US, which, in 1959, was one of the cheapest around. Of course, it didn't have the full number-crunching capabilities of an IBM mainframe, but it put its focus in other areas. Much of the design was built from the TX-0, though with increased real-time capabilities and a 1024 by 1024 circular point-plotting screen. The screen was optional, not every system shipped with it, but it would become a vital component in the system's most famous program. The culture which produced the programmers, or hackers, who would take on the PDP-1 originated at the birthplace of Whirlwind, MIT. There was a club there, founded in 1946, called the Tech Model Railroad Club, TMRC. Known for its expansive model railway system, and sometimes eccentric members. They created for themselves a humorous interpersonal lingo and thrived on experimentation. The term hack, to them, meant a project undertaken for fun. Jack Dennis, an MIT professor who was previously a member of the TMRC, granted the club members access to the TX-0 computer that was placed on loan to the college, giving them free rein to have a go at it when not otherwise being used. A new computer culture began to brew, with several of the club's members taking advantage and writing programs for the machine like calculators and text editors. However, in 1961, when word came that soon a PDP-1 would be installed at MIT, that's when the scheming began. 3 young former workers from the nearby Harvard Lydiard Statistical Laboratory, J. Martin Graetz, Wayne Wheatonen, and Steve Russell, convened in late summer 1961 to find out what kind of program they would like to write for the PDP-1. Wheatonen was an avid programmer and roomed with Graetz, who was working for Jack Dennis at the time, thus he brought the computer to the group's attention. And Russell was a former TMRC member who would help implement the programming language Lisp onto the IBM 704 at MIT. The group had been inspired by the earlier demo programs such as Bouncing Ball and Mouse, which had been displayed at MIT for the public, and wished to create a real-time showcase of the PDP-1's capabilities, coupled with a love of science fiction films and literature kindled by the ongoing space race. Wheatonen suggested that this game should, unlike passive demo programs, be a competition between participants which required skill. Space War was the game they set out to make, an arena-based shooter involving a battle between two ships in space. Before they could get started, though, Wheaton was called into active military service, and Grates finished his work with Dennis to work in another part of MIT. This left Steve Russell, a brilliant programmer nicknamed Slug, to take on the task. Russell had been under the impression that his suggestion for a program was just that, an idea for someone else to take on, but he was really the only one that could do it. He talked the game up with all of his TMRC pals, and they all agreed. Somebody should do it. The group slowly managed to get him into the programming mood, but when faced with the final hurdle of tackling the PDP-1 sine-cosine routines to register the positions of the moving ships, team member Alan Kotak drove all the way to deck headquarters to acquire the documentation, then put it in front of Russell to see if there was any other excuse. There wasn't, and so off to work he went. At the very end of 1961, the PDP's Type 30 display terminal arrived, and work could truly begin. Despite the origins from outside the TMRC group, the game turned out to be an amalgamation of technologies out of the PDP-1 hacking scene. Inspiration quickly took Russell from two indeterminate specks floating in an empty space to constructing two individual ships, the Needle and the Wedge, against a background of randomly generated stars. These ships were dictated by a somewhat realistic simulation of physics, wherein a ship or torpedo would not stop moving until it came into contact with other forces, and would build momentum. The one initial exception to this realism was the ability for ships to turn without any sort of sideways thrusters. By February 1962, Russell had constructed an initial prototype consisting purely of shooting ships with a limited supply of torpedoes and fuel. The torpedoes would detonate after a certain period of time, but could actually wrap around the entire screen along with the ships. This extension of the circular display was dubbed the curvature of space, as a wonky but colorfully scientific explanation of this abstract mechanic. Russell deposited the paper tape of this half-complete game to be accessible to the TMRC's members, so that the other hackers could start adding the necessary flourish. There was so much more to do. Upon examining the background, one TMRC member named Dan Edwards noticed a star towards the middle of the screen which appeared brighter than the others. With a sense of curiosity, he wondered what if that star was like a sun and constituted a gravitational pull on the ships. As Russell couldn't figure out how to do that, it fell to Edwards to come up with the programming necessary to enact this change. Edwards discovered that, as he attempted to exert gravity on all the objects during the whole runtime, the computer's processor was simply not fast enough to keep up with everything. Each player could fire up to 11 torpedoes, and the game already did not run optimally due to Russell's own coding limitations. Edwards decided to limit the force to the ships themselves, leaving the projectiles unaffected, and created a special compile method which would help the machine process these complex physics calculations. It was a lot of effort, but a very smart move. The nature of the game changed right there, from a race to shoot or be shot, into a game where the actual play space was important to the game itself, marking a crucial breakaway from the pure simulations of old. While running into the sun only teleported the player, not killing them, it was still advantageous to avoid it where possible. Since they couldn't have the torpedoes interact with the sun, they called them photon torpedoes, and decided that they should go through the sun as well. Initially, players didn't like this decision, as they, upon orbiting the sun, would run into their own projectiles. However, likely the additional strategy element overrode these concerns, so the torpedoes were kept operating independently from the rest of the environment. With the highly scientific flair added by the central star, another member of the group named Peter Sampson took his own approach to realism. He decided to reproduce an accurate star chart for the game known as Expensive Planetarium, a play on some of the TMRC's earlier hacks which used the same prefix. This star background was modeled on a particular area of the night sky, as seen from Earth, which included most of the recognizable constellations from astronomy. The background would move across this elaborately realized pattern during play, which, while eating at the available memory, provided a truly scientific flair to the setting. The addition of Expensive Planetarium was actually an entirely separate program patched into the main Space War game, overriding the previous star display and showing the versatility of the programming at work. In this fervent period of development, taking place over mid to late March 1962, the hackers also decided to solve the problem of the PDP-1's native clunky inputs. It was very easy to accidentally flip a wrong switch because the control panels were not exactly made ergonomically for this sort of intense game-playing action. Student Robert Saunders constructed custom boxes for the game with 3 inputs which sat in 2 hands. One lever controlled the rotation, backwards throttle for thrusters, with forwards being reserved for an as-yet unimplemented feature, and the button fired the torpedoes. What do you hit that with, your wrist? Towards the end of this heady development process, Martin Great stepped back in to add a bit of beautification with a tight little explosion of particles for the ship. The first completed version of Space War was showcased to the club and immediate public at the very end of April 1962 for the annual MIT Parents' Day open house in the science department, coming to life for the club to great aplomb. This hardly meant the end of Space War's career, though. Shortly after its initial demonstration, the program was given its full final features. Namely, Greats added a mechanic called hyperspace, which served as the last-ditch survival strategy for wayward pilots about to meet their peril. However, it teleported them to a random spot on the screen with some momentum carrying them, meaning that they could be in as much danger as they were previously. Each player had 3 jumps, and when activated, it would display a pattern ripped straight out of another PDP-1 demonstration, a display called Minskytronic, so named after MIT professor Marvin Minsky. Hyperspace was patched into the game along with a scoring system to limit playtime, as well as an auto-restart function. This form was the true culmination of the original desire to create the ultimate demo program. After a period of absence from the program, Steve Russell returned to the game in September 1962 to create what would become the true codified version, Space War 3.1. Around this time, he would follow AI pioneer Joseph McCarthy across the country from Massachusetts to Stanford University in California. There, they established the foundation of an artificial intelligence program at the university, and Space War was brought there on tape. It quickly infected the school's PDP-1 and became so rampantly popular that a time ban was instituted on playing the game. The menace of Space War had crossed universities, quickly becoming a staple for showcasing the PDP-1, and Digital Equipment even made their own brochure to feature the game as a celebration of its achievement. Space War is widely acknowledged as the breakout moment for video games. The principles which DEC sought to instill with its computer line had produced a game which would grow into a phenomenon. Many games yet to come will trace their origins directly to Space War, and yet, the product was still not owned by anyone. The project had been made as a hack, a cool idea which took a community to design and perfect. Nobody owned it, yet everybody had a piece of it to take away. Space War defines what the general public would come to identify as a video or computer game. The shooting, the geeky sci-fi theme, and the visuals meant to allure. Control still had some hashing out to do, from bulky boxes to more manageable hand-sized knobs, but Space War still stands as a testament of both programming and design. Video games were taking shape.